welcome everybody to the ABCs of developing a quick pitch to attract investment capital and licensing partners. This webinar is being broadcast by the UAS Cluster Initiative. My name is Amanda Radovic. I'm the program manager for the Cluster Initiative, and I have run the Development Capital Network's Accelerator program for over a decade. So during that time, I've worked with over 700 companies in commercialization projects and developing pitches. So this is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. The Cluster Initiative is a program of the Small Business Administration in Washington, D.C. We are one of 14 clusters around the country. Each has a geographic region and an industry sector of focus. So our industry sector of focus is Unmanned Aerial Systems, and our geographic region is Oklahoma and Kansas. Through this contract with the SBA, we have been able to provide many programs in the form of education, webinars, commercialization, capital formation, economic development, you name it. We're trying to really provide a lot of resources for the entire ecosystem and bring them together. So we're excited to be able to do that. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about quick pitches. We have two really great speakers with a ton of experience. So I will get started with our first panelist. Our first panelist today is Crately Epperson. And Crately is the CEO and founder of Vigilant Aerospace Systems, Inc. He has a 20-year career as a technology company executive and founder, advisor, and investor. In his former life, he was a software developer, software architect, and he has founded or co-founded or advised 25 technology companies, including as co-founder and chief technology officer of Questia Media, which raised $160 million in venture capital. No small task. Crately has also created and served as the adjunct professor for Rice's University's first undergraduate course in entrepreneurship. And in 2013, he co-founded and managed a venture accelerator. So Crately has over 17 years being a judge for the Rice Business Plan Competition, which is one of the largest business plan competitions in the nation, if not the world. So Crately, thank you for being here today. I'm going to introduce our next panelist. John is the president of Intelligent Innovation. He's an internationally recognized corporate coach, speaker, and author. He does have a book called Intelligent Innovation Revealed, and includes tips on funding, intellectual property strategy, and himself, he holds several international and U.S. patents. So we have two panelists today who have a lot of experience in both raising funds, in both reviewing pitches and presentations. So Crately, I'll go to you first. If you could tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. Thank you very much for the introduction. I am currently running Vigilant Aerospace Systems. So we are a UAS technology company here in Oklahoma. We have licensed NASA's detect and avoid system for unmanned aircraft. So we are raising money right now. So this is something near and dear to my heart. I have been involved in fundraising, and particularly almost always starting with angel fundraising, with quick pitches, sometimes at events, sometimes just in the elevator. You'll give an elevator pitch. I judge a lot of business plan competitions, including the Rice Business Plan Competition, and so I see hundreds of pitches a year, and I have a tendency to take notes on everything I see. So this is a topic that I think is critical to the success of any startup, and I'm very happy to be here and participate and answer any questions about my experiences with it.
Thank you. So John, I'll turn it over to you if you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. First of all, I'm really glad to be here, and I love doing this. I do a lot of essentially volunteer coaching through National Science Foundation, DCN, WBT, etc. And I teach augment at Babson Graduate School of Management for just this type of thing. How do you develop a rocket pitch? Where does it go? How do you do that? And not only from the investor's point of view, but from the consumer's point of view. And just enjoy doing that. And firms of all types, really. I've worked in aerospace, automotive, even NASCAR racing, food, and everyone is different. Everyone is exciting in their own way, and so happy to be here.
Well, thank you both. So before we get into some of our questions, I want to kind of frame this conversation, why pitches are so important. So somebody once told me this, that, and this is early stage investment. So if you have a technology and you're looking for investment or a licensing partner, there are only so many early stage technology investors. And then go a step further, only so many of those investors actually have raised a fund. And then go one step further, of those investors who have currently raised a fund, there's only so many that are actually investing in new deals. So just to give you a sense, they see thousands and thousands of technology commercialization investment opportunities per year that come across their desk that are referred to them. But as you can imagine, if you look at what the investment cycle, the number of these investors investing at any given time is very small. So that is why the pitch is so critical. If you get that audience, this could be a chance that you have, and that's why it's so important. So I just want to frame the conversation with that today, and I'll kind of ask you, our panelists, and I'll start with John, you know, in reviewing deals, how many deals have come across your desk, you know, every year, and how many investments in your experience are typically made in any given year?
Wow, it's hard to answer that without being discouraging. Very few really get funded. You know, you could see 100 and maybe 2 or 3 will get funded. And I think the key, really, to the couple that get funded is really people that understand their impact. And we'll go into a little bit more of that later, but that's the word I keep bringing up, is this idea of impact. It's impact to the investor, which a lot of pitches get. What is my return going to be if I invest $500,000 with you? Well, I get 6% or 10%. But they forget the other aspects of impact, the impact to the consumer, the impact to the consumer's consumer, and we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. Who's your customer's customer? Impact to society, impact to the employees. So those are the pitches that really make it the whole way.
Great. So Craigly, I'll ask you the same question, and knowing that you've been participating in the Rice Business Plan competition for so many years, you've seen a lot of pitches, but in your experience and as being an investor, how many, putting your investor hat on, you know, how many deals do you see every year, and in your experience, you know, how many get invested in?
So I've also been involved in a couple of venture capital funds. I've run a couple of tech funds that were associated with an accelerator, and we had venture capital backers, so we had direct access to their investment stream all the time because we were recruiting people into the accelerator. So they were seeing between 400 and 800 deals submitted to them a year, and they did 3 to 4 deals a year. And that was pretty typical from what I've seen. Now, submitted is a pretty light benchmark. It just means somebody sent you something, and a lot of them were just not going to be a fit or a match because the person hadn't figured out what the micro-cap venture capital firm was focused on, and so they'd sent something inappropriate. So probably half of those you knock out at the front. But it's a very small percentage. So of the 300 or 400 that they'd really look at pretty closely, they ended up doing kind of at the height of a fund, 3 or 4 a year.
So, and we did a previous webinar as part of our webinar series on venture investment. So we went into some of those details there, but today we're going to focus on the pitch. So you get that opportunity, and what kind of information is critical to get their attention. Because like the name of the game is getting their attention. So there's actually a slide up on the screen right now. I just want to let everybody know that we will open this up to Q&A at the end of our conversation. You can just go ahead and type your questions into the chat box. That is part of your GoToWebinar panel, control panel off to the side, and then we'll get to some of those questions a little bit later. So pitches are all different lengths. There can be 2 minutes, 6 minutes, the 30-second elevator pitch. So it doesn't really matter what the length of it is, but in a typical quick pitch or rocket pitch, as you call them, what are you looking for in those, those minutes that you have? What are really the critical pieces of information that you're looking for when when these presenters don't have much time? So, Crayley, I'll start with you, and then John, I'll ask you the same question.
Okay, so when I'm looking at a pitch that is say your typical 6 to 15 minute pitch, you really just have enough time to get people interested. You're not going to answer a lot of questions. You're not going to answer any technical questions. You're really just focused on trying to get people interested. And so the first thing that I'm always looking for is to have a good problem story. And if you get nothing else across, if you get the problem story across, and then a solution story, and a little bit about how your solution story is competitive or has some sort of advantage to solve that problem, that might be all you get. But if you have enough time, you really want a customer story. And many pitches, very good pitches, start with the customer story. This customer looks like this and has this problem. And that sets up the whole thing if you do that story well. And then finally, if you get an opportunity after you discuss your problem, what your customer with that problem looks like, what your solution looks like, and then you can get into things like your team, just a little bit about your team, because that's so important for most investors. The team is sometimes more important than the problem and the solution. And then talk a little bit about how you are going to market, how you're going to reach that market after you've told the story. So if you tell those things and you have a story you can tell, you're going to attract people's attention much faster, and they're going to be able to understand what you're getting at much faster, rather than starting from a dry or sort of technical presentation about what your pitch is. And even in an elevator, you can do that. You can tell a story about one client in an elevator in 30 seconds. And if you can do that, you might get that next question. And that's really what you're aiming for.
That's great. So yeah, it's really about storytelling. So I just want to do kind of a follow-up question. So in terms of the technology, because I know people they get excited about the technology and they really want to talk about that. So and this is kind of a different type of conversation or story that you're telling when you're doing a quick pitch. How much of it should be technical? How much should you go into the technical components?
Obviously it depends a little bit on who you're talking to. If you have someone whose primary interest is in the technology, obviously that could be a great place to start. But if you're talking to investors, or you're talking to people who are interested primarily just from a strategic point of view, what you're really trying to get is the next series of questions. You're not trying to answer questions, you're trying to get people's interest so that they will ask you the next set of questions. Because a quick pitch is never going to answer everybody's question. What you have to do is whet people's appetite, you have to get them excited, and that's usually around the story of how you would use the technology to solve an important problem. And so if you do the problem story well, and you do the solution and the customer story well, for most people, that's what they need in the quick pitch in order to get interested to look at your technology. So generally, technology, if you're talking to investors or potential strategic partners or people that want to get involved, the technology is not where you would start with that story for a quick pitch.
Great. So John, I'll go to you. I'll ask you the same question. If you're watching rocket pitches, what are you looking for in that short amount of time that they have your attention? How are they going to keep your attention, and what are you looking for?
Well, I think I'm going to be really in a lot of agreement with Crayley. I look for the 4 whats and a why. So the first what is really, it sounds like Monty Python. What is your quest? What is that solution space you're trying to fill, or what we call a gap and an overlap? What is the thing or the story, as Crayley say, that you're trying to do? But really, it needs to go farther than that. So the second what is really, what do you offer? What is your discriminator? And this is where you put in a little bit of the technology, what makes you unique, but it needs to go farther than that. What is the customer set you're trying to fill, et cetera, et cetera. You keep going down with that. But then probably most importantly, one of the things I look for is the last thing is the when. So when gets into a technology roadmap. What are the drops that you're going to have, both in intellectual property and then resulting revenue from them? What is the essentially technology? How is it developing? We understand you might start at a low TRL, or if you don't use that word, a low maturity. As long as you're honest with that and you say to the investors, hey, here's where we are today, here's where I'm going to be in 6 months, and here's where I'm going to be in 2 years or then 6 years with your money, and here's how that's going to unfold. That's what people really want to see is that roadmap of the when and how you understand the customer in each of those spots during the when.
So you bring up a good point, and it's a question that I often get a lot, is should there be a financial slide, and if there is, how much information should you be giving? You know, because yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can go with that. How, you know, what do you like to see when it's in terms of financial information, or do you not want to see any?
No, that's a really good question. I do want to see it. I want it to be clear, and I want it to be short. The old days of 40-page business plans that the big business schools taught, those are long gone, right? No one has time for a 40-page business plan. I might want to know that you sweated some of those details in your backup, though, because I don't want to feel like I'm getting snowed with very high-level information. But for the rocket pitch, yeah, it's 1 page. It's the margin. Want you to understand that you have a certain manufacturing cost, a delivery and distribution cost, and what's left over is for me for margin, right? I want to see how much of the margin you're ultimately going to put back into product development. So I want to see that return, some of it going back into IRAD, to research and development, some going out to the investor, some going into your own pocket. One of the key things, at least in the Boston, New York corridor, one of the main reasons business plans get declined is because the entrepreneur says, well, I'm going to starve for 3 years. My children will have no food. My husband or wife will hate me because there's no cell phone, because I'm going to live for nothing for 3 years, and then at the end, I'm going to be a millionaire. And an investor sees right through that, says, you know, that's not a tenable situation. I want you to eat, right? I want your cell phone to turn on. So those expenses need to be realistic.
So Crayley, I'll ask you the same thing. I mean, what, in terms of financials, in a quick pitch, what are you hoping to see, or what do you not want to see?
I strongly agree with John that having one slide probably in a typical, you know, that 10 to 15 minute kind of time frame is the most that you want to have on your financials. It should be very clear. What I think most investors know is that all of that is extremely speculative. And so what they're looking for is that you have a thought process, that you have some background information like John talked about, that you've done that work, that you've thought it through, that you understand something about what your risks are, and that's all expressed through that slide. So you might have a lot of questions later on. Those might be important follow-up questions to your pitch. You want that one slide that talks about, this is how big our market is, this is how we're going to capture it, and this is what it looks like in a graph as we capture that market. And then also, if you can, you put, here's what our expenses are. And really, there are lots of great examples of great slides that do that. And that's really all you want in a quick pitch, typically. Because again, you're not really trying to answer questions, you're trying to prompt questions, really good questions. You know, a great question from an investor about that kind of slide might be, well, what if we gave you more money and you grew faster? Or what if you produced in a different way, or sold in a different way? What would that do to your numbers? And what they're really probing for is that you're able to respond to those questions intelligently because you've got the information that you've done the work on in the background to be able to adjust that on the fly and talk to them about what those scenarios do for your company.
That's a good point. It's a good point. So I often have a lot of people, you mentioned market research, and I have a lot of people that often ask, well, where do I find market research? It sounds like such a basic question, but it's something that's pretty critical, and that investors or licensee wants to know that you have some knowledge about the market that you intend to go into, or that you're looking at first, your entry point. So, you know, what would you say to someone who says, okay, I need market research, where can I find that? And Crately, I'll have you answer that first, then John, I'll ask you the same question.
I have recently had that experience. The unmanned aircraft space and all the supporting technologies is very, very new, and so there's not a lot of market research. Obviously, Google is your friend, and you can start there, and then you have to really grade the credibility and the different types of value and nuances of the information that you find, particularly when you're looking at other people's forecasts that may be biased in one way or another. Industry forecasts and industry information is readily available. You go out and you search for it. If you need access to proprietary information, your local library may be a fantastic resource. The business library at your local university may have things that they pay, $10,000 to $100,000 a year for access to, and you can walk in and look at that database, and a librarian may be able to help you. So there's actually some great resources out there. You may have to get off the internet and go talk to some people. But you can ask people in your industry, the industry groups, and ask them, where do you look for numbers about what you would like to manufacture and what the market looks like for that. But typically, I'm looking at industry resources. You will find a lot of paid-for analytics reports that are often very expensive, between $500 and $5,000 if you get into niche manufacturing or niche software areas. And in startups, you almost never buy those. What you do is you look at the big numbers, and then you break it down as best you can with other research sources. Almost always the big numbers are available, even if the research report that they come from was $5,000. And we see people do that all the time. So you have to get creative sometimes. And sometimes you have to go to the library and look at the industry journals and plow through and find where they publish their annual report about their industry niche.
Thank you. So it's not just as easy as Googling.
Google is where you start, but you may have to go further than that for sure. Yeah.
Gotcha. So John, I'll ask you the same question, because you probably get this a lot. When you're looking for market research, where would you tell somebody to go?
I agree with a lot of the things Craig said, and I'm a real big proponent of a mix between the hard copies, the research, the computer-generated data, and going out and shaking hands in the industry. What I look for most is people who understand the naysayers, and they found a few. So your mother always thinks you're pretty, right? And your mother always thinks you're smart. But I want to hear that they talk to some people that said, that market's tough, and I'm not sure about your product. You might want to do X, Y, and Z to it to make it better. I really look for some of that to balance out the data they found. It gets into this idea of accuracy versus relevancy. I'm much more into relevancy. Is the data relevant to my decision as an investor? Is the data relevant to your decision as an entrepreneur to bring this forward? If it's accurate to the fourth decimal point because you found one of those $100,000 reports, that's wonderful that you got to look at it. And I actually kind of want to see it too. But I'm much more interested, did you pick out the right data from that report? And is it balanced?
I like that. You made a really good point, showing that you are aware of the roadblocks or the challenges, not just putting in there that it's a huge market and everything's great and you're completely unfamiliar or don't know anything about the challenges that you might face. So it's a good point. So this is kind of the million-dollar question, and John, I'll kind of ask you first. What would absolutely make you tune out? I mean, what are just some of the really basic mistakes that a presenter can make where your brain shuts down, tunes out, and it's over?
There's definitely the ones, I think both Crayley and I have mentioned, the idea of not understanding your risks or not understanding the naysayers. So the glass is too full. Those I immediately, there's so many different sensors that can sense temperature, pressure, those kind of things. There's no one best one. What I'm looking for is, did you integrate it properly? Is it at the right price point? Do you have the correct distribution channel? Do you have the right people on your team? Do you have the right partners? So those kind of things, the holistic answer is what I want. And someone who comes in with that sort of arrogance that they know it all, that's an immediate kind of turn off there.
So Crayley, I'll ask you the same thing. You've seen probably thousands of pitches. You know, what's the thing that makes you just tune out, and some common mistakes or mistakes you see a lot that people make?
So I've got a few items that are deal killers immediately. The magic box. If you've got a technology that is so proprietary and so confidential that you really can't describe it and talk about it, I have seen some of those recently, and that just isn't going to go anywhere. Your major risk always in a startup is that nobody cares and nobody really wants your product. It's not that somebody's going to rip off your idea. There are engineering, topics that may be proprietary, but overall, you've got to be able to talk extensively about what you're doing, and you've got to get over any idea that you're going to have confidentiality agreements with investors. They just don't sign them. So that's number one, is you've got to be confident that you can go out there and talk about it. The best thing since sliced bread, obviously, when you really are not looking at your competition and you're not realizing that your competitors may be other ways to achieve the same result, even if they're not competitors with your technology. So you'll see sometimes someone who's selling a great solution for a particular problem, but the way everybody solves that problem now is they have the person in a room who solves that problem for them, and that's their solution, and it's inexpensive and it works for them. That's a situation where you're going to have to overcome that, and sometimes people don't realize that. Very crowded markets without very clear differentiators, product differentiators, that's a huge problem. And if you can't immediately talk to that with one or more major differentiators, so you have a bit of a moat around your business. If you can't address that, at least when I ask about it, that's going to be a real problem. And then the other thing is, if you come to the table with a team that's either all engineering and no business people, or all business people and no engineering team really behind it, that's usually an indication that the pitch is really not mature. The company is not mature to a point that it should probably be raising money yet. So
those are all great points. So I'm going to kind of move on to aesthetics and actually viewing the pitch and kind of the mechanics of it. So in terms of slides, props, follow-up materials, I mean, what do you recommend is kind of the sweet spot for all those things, or that is kind of the norm of what people are used to looking at, because sometimes you can have 80 slides, 2 slides, do you want to see them, what do you ultimately want to see at the end of the day? And so, John, I'll ask you first. What would you like to see in terms of the mechanics and the aesthetics of a pitch?
Well, I think they are important. And, years ago we used to say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and now a video's worth 1,000 pictures, so I guess it's 1,000,000 words. So I really like to see 5 or 6 PowerPoint slides with a large number in backup. If I want to flip through backup, if I have that kind of time, great. But I really want about 5 or 6 slides in an embedded video. There's some people that you can hire for short money that make 1-minute videos, so professional, and it really does convey, 1,000 words. So that's kind of the size and shape that I look for. At the very least, pictures, but really most are beyond that now. Some people will put in a link that goes out to more detail towards the end. I'm fine with that, but honestly, most of us live on our phones on a train, so a link isn't the best thing. But that's the size and shape. 5, 6, 7, 10 at the most. PowerPoint slides, a lot of backups, okay, and a video.
Wonderful. So Crayley, I'll ask you the same thing, in terms of the actual pitch itself and the slides and how it looks. What are you looking for, and what would you recommend?
There are several things that I do as I'm actively pitching right now, and one of the most important things is that I have one version of the pitch that is to actually be presented. It is very text light. It has graphics and pictures that will support what I'm saying, but it's intended to be presented. It's intended to really capture people's attention, not on the slide deck, but on what I'm talking about. Oftentimes I'll have big bullet points, 3 to 5 max per slide, no more than 5 bullets per slide. If you go beyond that, you're really trying to give somebody a narrative, and you don't want to do that in the slide deck. I have a separate PowerPoint that I can send people, and it is very different. It's text heavy. It is for investors and VCs that are used to doing that look through it, they want to read everything, maybe have links out. It's for them to do in their leisure time, but it is not for me to present, because I don't want that kind of text when I'm presenting. The other thing that I should mention at this point is that really you're the product. When you are pitching in a quick pitch, one of the reasons you don't want everybody staring at your slides and trying to read a bunch of small font stuff is that they need to fall in love with the idea of you building this business and your team and the fact that you've got a solution and you're telling them a story that's very interesting and engaging. So that's what you really have to do in the quick pitch. All of those details can be provided later. They've got to fall in love with your team and with your idea. The other thing is I keep a one-pager, which is usually an investor one-pager. There's lots of nice formats for that. It's very concise, but it has a lot of that information. It's the kind of thing that you can send out to people rather than sending them a full PowerPoint to go through. Some people really do just do the PowerPoint, but we actually have a one-pager, and that's either before or after the presentation. Sometimes that's how you get the opportunity to make the presentation, is by having sent that one-pager investor executive summary.
Great. And you had mentioned, I know you are raising funds right now, so this is a topic that you are actively engaged in at the moment. When you are presenting to someone, do you tweak your presentation based on who it is, what it is, the event, the audience, the person, or do you just use the kind of a standard, you said you have your pitch deck that you use for actual pitching. Do you just kind of use the standard deck and go with that?
So having done this for a long time, I have probably 60 to 80 slides in a template deck, and I'll pick the 10 to 15, maybe 20 if it's a really long presentation that goes into any particular pitch. Those other slides are all backup slides, and occasionally they'll become a primary slide, but not usually. But it grows every time I give a presentation, because if it's a good presentation to people who are very interested, I will get a new question. And if it's a good question, that becomes a new slide to answer that question. I love questions that make me make a new slide, right? Because it means that my pitch is maturing. It means I'm understanding better about what people are interested in. But that's how I do it. And so I do typically tweak it a little bit. And I have a version that's 10 slides that's for like 10 minutes. And then I have a version that's 15 slides that's for the slightly longer, 20 to 30 minutes sort of presentation. And then I have slides I can swap in and out.
Okay, good. That's good advice. So John, that kind of leads us into the next question that I had. So after you make your pitch, and I get this question from a lot of presenters, what kinds of questions should they be prepared to answer? So you've made your pitch, you have somebody who is interested, they want to have a follow-up conversation with you. What kind of questions could you expect? Should you have the information for? Should you be prepared for? We kind of touched on that with additional slides and follow-up questions, but specifically, what advice would you give?
Well, I think, of course, you should be prepared for the audience. So if you're in front of a bunch of financial people, you might want to have a few of your backup numbers memorized. If you're in front of doctors, lawyers, whoever, you need to be a little bit brushed up on that area. But the two things I think they should really have ready, just to roll off as more of a matter of fact, is understanding their intellectual property strategy. And the answer to that is not, it's a black box, or I have a patent. That's not the right answer. You need to understand your IP strategy and be able to roll it off very quickly. The other thing I think that's important is if the audience is astute, you will get questions that have nothing to do with the actual pitch. What's your family life like? That's one I've heard many times, because they want to know, are you supported at home? What is your plan for the future with the company? Where will it be located? Those kind of sort of general softer questions that come from the left or right side that you might not be prepared for, you really want a quick, nice, clean answer for them. They're probing. If they're smart, they're probing. They're looking for a little weakness.
And again, that kind of goes to, you know, the team. Who are the people behind it? Who are the people that are going to be creating this company and doing the work every day?
Right.
It becomes very personal.
And one thing I think that comes up really is many investors think of themselves as a partner. And so one thing they might ask is, well, what would you think if I stop in on every Tuesday afternoon and give you advice, right? It's their money. They want to have a little bit of control. Some are silent, which is great, but most of them want to have their finger on it at least at some point. And I think that's a good thing. You should be open to that. But it's also a complex topic.
So Crayley, I'll ask you the same question. You know, what should a presenter be prepared for after if they've gotten somebody interested enough to have that follow-up conversation?
The questions, the immediate follow-up questions that I often see and that I often ask are more detailed questions about competitors, because usually in a quick pitch you might have one slide on competition. People want to probe on that. It's something where they can very quickly assess whether you really know your market, whether you really know your competitors. People who are in the industry, who are investors that are very interested in what you're doing because they're in your industry, will bring up a lot of different competitors. And being able to very quickly say, yes, we've looked at that. Here's what we think about this competitor. It's really important. It's important to be able to answer that question. It's a very common question. Similarly, you might have a technical question. You might say, you know, there's another way to do this I've heard about that looks like this. How does that fit into your business plan and your technology? And you've got to have great answers for that, maybe even a slide for that compares different ways to solve a particular problem. That's one of my backup slides I almost always have is a great slide about the competition and about other ways to do it with different technologies.
That's good advice. So we're going to start Q&A. I'm going to open it up to Q&A in a little bit. So just kind of a final question, and this might be a difficult one to answer. I mean, if there was one thing that would get you hooked when you were listening to a presentation, what, in your mind, what would that be? So Crayley, I'll start with you, and then John, I'd love to hear the answer to this question.
Sure, I gave this a little bit of thought, and you know, the thing that I think is most compelling is a great customer story. So if you can, particularly if you can tell a whole life cycle story. There was this customer, this was their problem. This is how we solved that problem for them, and this is what it looks like now. That gives a full kind of picture and a full life cycle. And if I come away from your pitch, whether short, medium, or long, and I remember that story, and I remember how your solution had a big impact and was solving something that was important, that's what's going to get people hooked. And I've had that experience over and over with investors, is they'll remember that story, and they hang their whole investment thesis on that story.
All right, so the story. So John, I'll ask you the same question. What is the one thing that would really get you hooked when you're listening to a rocket pitch?
My answer is going to be similar. The one thing for me is the impact to the customer's customer. Do they understand the customer's customer? So if they take that story, that's what I'm going to remember. What I mean by that is, I'll give you a very simple example. If you're at a dealership, and a car dealership, and you're selling a Volvo, it's a medium to high priced car. Your customer is the parent, is the person buying the car. But the customer's customer really is generally not that person. What they're doing is buying a car that they think is safer for their kids. So that's why they're in the Volvo dealer to begin with, right? If you're at a sports car dealer, the customer's customer might not be the wealthy middle-aged man. It's really that he's trying to attract someone else, a partner, right? So people who understand those subtleties, the customer's customer, are the people I'm more interested in because their story is full. It goes all the way. I think Crayley said the life cycle. I want to know the whole life cycle of your story, of your product story. Where is that product going to end up, and does it fill that gap in the market? And then I'm interested, because I'm going to understand that. If you can present it properly, I'm going to get it. Even if your technology is in a world I have no understanding of, I'll understand that you filled that gap for me. but it's not generally the first, what we call a market segment. It's not the immediate market segment. I want to know what's behind that.
So it's really interesting. I mean, I've heard a lot here that people are always generally so focused on the technology, and really that has so little to do with sometimes the actual pitch, the presentation when you have a quick pitch. It's really about the impact and the opportunity. So those are all helpful, very helpful as people put together presentations. So I do have some questions here from our audience, so I will open it up. And we have a question from John. What are some realistic ways to evaluate the value of a startup? That's a question that I get a lot too, valuation. So John, if you can, I'll have you answer first, and then Craigly, you probably just went through this process, so it would be interesting to hear your experience.
Yeah, so the traditional way, of course, is to look at your revenues, look at your margins, and project them out. Again, you have to be comfortable with the difference between relevancy and accuracy. What we're looking for is relevancy. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be realistic. So when you project out, let's say 5 years is probably enough. Who knows what's going to happen after that? You know, you want to say, well, I'm going to get 0.001% of the market for the first year, 0.002% of the market the second year. Here's how that works out. So that shows me the person understands the market, they understand their margins, their revenues, etc. So that's part of it. But I also think that, again, going back to that holistic understanding is important, that they're going to have that in the pitch, essentially.
So greatly, I'll ask you the same question. Valuation, I mean, especially in different industry sectors, some are probably easier than others. You've done this in unmanned aerial systems. It's a new industry, newer industry sector, so I imagine it's a bit more difficult, but how are you, what would you suggest to someone who's trying to come up with something reasonable and conservative?
Sure. So what John just described is the starting point for evaluation, understanding what your forecast looks like, what your sales projections look like, what the potential profitability of your company looks like, what your EBITDA looks like five years out. You should have all of that. But the other thing that I would add to that is really important is you need to look at what other investments have been made in and near your market, and you need to look at what investors are paying. So some of that information is a little bit difficult to find sometimes, but if you are raising money in a market that is hot, you will get a much better valuation, and that's just the reality. So one of the first things we always do is we go out and look at who's invested in what recently in our industry, and particularly if there are acquisitions, you can get the ultimate price that was paid for those companies, and that's extremely important because you don't really know. You can't really forecast what your revenues are going to be. It's really just speculation. You may have to pivot a year or 2 years into your business, but what you're really doing is you are trying to find investors that value what you're doing. And the best way to do that is figure out where else they're investing and who's acquiring companies that do something that's like what your company does, and how much they paid for it.
Right.
That's great. That is one of the tougher things for someone to do as they're getting ready to talk to investors and figure out their financials. So that's helpful information.
Yeah, Amanda, I would agree with that, and just add real quick, I like to see multiple net present values. So when you project out and you bring it back to today with your NPV, I want to see one done at 8%, at 10%, at 12%, which gets to what Craig Lee said, which understand what the other investments have been recently in that market, so you'll know whether 8% is realistic or not. On a hot market, you might get a 10. The other point I kind of forgot to mention is, again, back to your intellectual property. Valuing patents is a whole black art, but I want to see some attempt made to add in the value of the IP.
And so we have a lot of questions here, and I'm going to ask this question, and then we have time for a few more. So when you're looking for funding, let's just say it's a presentation to angel investors, or you're in a group of venture capitalists, or versus licensing and licensing scouts, are there going to be different, is the pitch going to be different in any way? So John, I'll start with you. I mean, so most of the time you are pitching to a mixed audience, but maybe there's times where you're not. I mean, would there be any changes that you would make if it was a mixed audience, or you were looking for maybe both funding and licensing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, licensing is really my forte, and they're almost completely different pitches. So back to your valuation question, if you're in a traditional environment, you're looking for investors, you would have the intellectual property or licensing component added in, and it would go out possibly as far as 20 years. But it's an additive aspect of your valuation. Now flip that, and you're in front of essentially some people who are interested in licensing. That's a very different pitch. It goes out a full 20 years. Sometimes you can go 40 years, depending on how you have your IP strategy set up. It involves partnerships. It involves sub-licensing. It involves trade secrets and patents. So there's multiple things going on there that you have to be able to speak that language. It is a different language than essentially the investors, the angels, and your venture capital firms. You almost have to speak both, because normally some aspect of both is what's happening in the investor's head. He or she is thinking, well, I'll invest in this, I'll put in $500,000, I'm going to get my return, but I'm also going to add a sub-license clause into the contract. So that way I actually have the right to sub-license your technology and take that revenue stream, which is pure profit. The other thing that's really interesting about licensing and sub-licensing is that $1 of licensing revenue is typically equal to about $50 of normal revenue. So if you have your $50 of revenue, it flows through all your EBITDA, your expenses, your profits, paying off your investors and all, you equal to $1 at the end. $1 of license revenue is pure money. And it's a very powerful aspect.
That's good. And how specific would you have to be in a quick pitch about this if you were talking about licensing? I mean, you kind of went into a lot of detail. I mean, what level of that detail would you include in a quick pitch?
I would, very short, you need to say, we accept sub-licenses or not. We have intellectual property strong enough to license or not. And you have to have those two things clear and like perfect, laser clear.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So Crately, you've probably done a little bit of both. So what would you say in terms of creating a pitch? If I'm a presenter or I'm a company and I'm looking for, let's just say I'm looking for licensing, I'm going for a licensing play, and I'm looking for funding. I'm just open to, different opportunities, different ways for strategic partnerships to take place. What would you recommend, in creating that pitch? What kind of information would you want to see?
I don't have a lot to add. John's answer on that was really great. And the thing that I've seen, and we have gotten questions on, are situations where people want to know what our upstream license looks like. And so we typically have a short version and a longer version of those terms available so that we are able to answer that question really quickly. And usually there's only 2 or 3 sort of core questions there, and that has to do with exclusivity and things like that. So in a quick pitch, those are the kinds of questions we answer quickly. And then when you get into licensing, all the things that John said are really what come to the fore.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So this is kind of a fun question. I think we have enough time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and this one is kind of a fun one because I know in my experience doing this for over a decade, the pitches tend to be very formulaic, and investors and licensees, they want that. That's why we're having this whole webinar, is what kind of information do you have to include to get their attention, and they're kind of used to seeing that, and they want to see that. They like to see the same. But have you seen, and Crately, I'll ask you this first, have you seen any unusual pitches or ways that people have done it differently and did it work? Was it successful? Sure.
So some of the fun things that I've seen in pitches that help attract a lot of attention, which is really what you're trying to do with a quick pitch, are props. Props are fantastic. Particularly when you're telling a story about a new technology, or you're telling a story about an impact, if you have a consumer product or something like that, those props can make a big difference. They make you much more memorable. There was a company that I saw pitch that was managing laboratory animals. Name of the company was, I think, Mouse House. And they had essentially an IoT product for managing laboratory mice. And they had, you know, the cage and the devices with them. I can't remember if they had a mouse or not, but I don't think they had a mouse, but they would have if they could have gotten away with it in that particular setting. So things like that, I think, can have a big impact. You know, we walk around with drones in our hands. You know, when we go make pitches, sometimes we're not talking about the drone. We make safety software, but people love to see that drone, and they love to see the transponders and how big they are, how small they are, and the antennas. Stuff like that I've found is very, very helpful in getting people's attention and making your pitch memorable.
I like that. I'll never forget, I saw a pitch by someone from the CIA, and they came out as a secret agent, and I still remember that today. It was highly unusual. So, John, I'll ask you the same question. What are some unusual tactics that you've seen that have worked?
Well, yeah, I'm just going to agree with Crayley. My favorite story, I think, is a friend of mine was a pharmaceutical sales, and there was really one humongous hospital in her area, and she just couldn't get in. They were very tightly controlled. And finally, as a last act of desperation, she mailed in one shoe to the purchasing agent, and she said, I just want to get a foot in the door, right? And it led to millions of dollars of sales for her. So it created that tactile, that prop-like experience is very good. That gets me really to the subject of prototypes, and again, what Crayley said, you know, bring in your drone, bring in something that I can touch, look at. If it's too big, okay, a video, or maybe just a piece of it, because we're all people. It helps make it real, makes it fun. You pass it around the table, anything like that, and then of course don't discount hospitality. So if you're hosting someone, make sure there's coffee, tea, water, things like that. Make sure it's just a nice room and those kind of things. Getting to that tactile and experience.
So I think we have time for quick answers on one more question, and maybe this is a difficult question to give a quick answer to. But you know, what is the best way to get the opportunity to pitch? You know, how when you're going around, I mean, do you give a lot of pitches all at once? Do you do the road show? You know, Crayley, you're doing this right now. Are you doing one pitch a month? And how are you kind of getting the opportunity for these pitches? I mean, there's lots of events that are related to pitching. You're part of the Rice Business Plan competition activities. What have you found is helpful or useful?
So fortunately, today in the world, there are a lot of mature angel networks. Most of them have a formal application process. You can literally just go to their webpage, fill out the form, upload your business plan or your executive summary or your pitch deck. They'll evaluate it usually pretty quickly within a few weeks. You know, most of them are doing a monthly event. And so there are a lot of opportunities like that. And they're really hundreds of those networks. What's nice is once you've presented in one of those networks, even if you don't find an investor there, they may make introductions or they may know of other networks to which you should be presenting. So when you're looking for seed and angel funding, that's a great place to start. They really do exist everywhere. And you can travel around and find them. Competitions are great. You have to be careful not to do too many competitions. It's very intensive. It takes a lot of time. It may or may not lead to investment. It's a great way to practice, a great way to get exposure to other startups and see what's going on and improve what you're doing. And then finally, you know, you've really got to use your network. You've got to do pitches, even to people who might not be a direct investor, but might introduce you to someone who is. And you've just got to be really sensitive to those opportunities and take them every chance you get.
I hear that a lot. Yeah, sometimes it's a numbers game. Take advantage of every single person you know, every conversation you have, because it could lead to something else. So John, I'll give you about a minute here. So what would you recommend? I mean, this is one of the questions I get a lot, and probably one of the hardest things to tackle is, you know, how can you get the opportunities to pitch, and where should you be looking?
Yeah, well, of course, everything that's already been said, and I have a client who's invented a new type of faucet, and he is the master of competitions. He seems to dig them out, find them. He flies around the country, presents, wins, gets the seed league money, goes to the next one. And I agree with Cradley, they are a little bit intensive. But what he's done that's so much more is he will not leave that competition without 5 names where he goes and follows up, and other investors, even other inventors looking for partnerships, collaboration. You know, collaboration is sort of the new thing. It's a little more open than things were 10 years ago. You show people your technology. You do have those conversations without NDAs. Not sure if it's right or wrong, but it is sort of the new way.
Thank you. It's good advice. So with that, I will wrap this up. And again, I just want to thank you both so much for all that you've been able to share with us today.